The London studios of Talk TV were arranged precisely as Piers Morgan preferred for his confrontational interview format. The set featured 2 chairs positioned close together to create an atmosphere of tension and immediacy, with stark lighting that emphasized every facial expression and gesture. Multiple cameras captured every angle of what was about to become one of the most explosive political interviews broadcast that year. Piers Morgan, the 60-year-old British television personality, known for his aggressive interviewing style and willingness to provoke his guests, sat reviewing his notes with visible anticipation. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, the Democratic congresswoman from Texas, whose meteoric rise in American politics had made her one of the most recognizable progressive voices in the country. At 43 years old, Crockett had built her reputation on articulate defenses of progressive policies, powerful speeches, addressing racial and economic justice, and an ability to remain composed under pressure that had served her well during contentious congressional hearings. What neither Morgan nor his production team fully anticipated was that this interview would not follow the usual pattern where Morgan dominated the conversation through volume and aggression. Instead, Crockett would deliver a moment of such calm, precise correction that it would completely dismantle Morgan's argument and leave him visibly flustered in front of millions of viewers. Before we examine the full details of this remarkable confrontation and analyze why Crockett's response resonated so powerfully with audiences worldwide, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel to ensure you receive our comprehensive coverage of the political moments that define contemporary discourse. We invite you to share in the comments section your location and perspective on whether aggressive interviewing serves the public interest, or whether it primarily generates controversy at the expense of substantive discussion. Now we shall proceed to examine precisely what transpired during this encounter and why it became a defining example of how composure and facts can triumph over volume and theatrics. Piers Morgan had established himself over 3 decades as one of the most controversial figures in British and American media. His career trajectory included editing tabloid newspapers in Britain, judging talent competitions, hosting morning television programs, and ultimately creating his own interview platform where he could exercise complete editorial control. Morgan's interviewing style deliberately provoked conflict, operating on the premise that confrontation made for compelling television and that his audience tuned in specifically to watch him challenge and sometimes berate his guests. He had conducted contentious interviews with everyone from politicians to celebrities, often raising his voice, interrupting repeatedly, and framing questions in ways designed to trap his subjects into defensive positions. His supporters viewed him as fearless and willing to ask difficult questions that more polite interviewers avoided. His critics considered him a bully who prioritized generating viral moments over genuine journalistic inquiry. Regardless of perspective, Morgan understood the mechanics of modern media and knew that controversial clips shared across social media platforms drove viewership and relevance. Morgan had been watching Jasmine Crockett's rise with particular interest, mixed with skepticism. As a self-described centrist who often criticized what he viewed as excessive political correctness and radical progressive politics, Morgan saw Crockett as emblematic of a wing of the Democratic Party that he believed had moved too far from mainstream values. He had commented on his show multiple times about her speeches and policy positions, characterizing her advocacy for criminal justice reform as soft on crime, her support for Medicare for all as economically illiterate, and her discussions of systemic racism as divisive identity politics. When his team successfully booked Crockett for an interview during her visit to London for a conference on international human rights law, Morgan immediately began preparing what he envisioned as a systematic dismantling of progressive ideology using Crockett as his representative target. He compiled statistics, prepared confrontational questions, and planned the interview structure to maximize opportunities for the kind of contentious exchanges that generated social media engagement and next-day news coverage. Jasmine Crockett approached the interview with full awareness of Morgan's reputation and methods. Her communications team had initially questioned whether appearing on his program served her interests. Given his history of hostile treatment toward progressive politicians and his platform's primarily conservative-leaning audience, however, Crockett made the strategic calculation that declining would allow Morgan to claim she was afraid to defend her positions, while appearing gave her an opportunity to reach audiences who might not otherwise encounter progressive arguments presented coherently. More importantly, Crockett possessed supreme confidence in her ability to handle confrontational interviews based on her legal background and her experience during congressional hearings, where hostile questioning was routine. She had spent 15 years as a civil rights attorney before entering politics, which meant she had extensive practice remaining composed while presenting complex arguments under adverse conditions. She prepared thoroughly for the interview by reviewing Morgan's previous confrontations, identifying his common rhetorical tactics, and developing clear, concise responses to the predictable lines of attack. The interview began with a deceptively civil opening as Morgan introduced Crockett to his audience, providing her background and noting her progressive positions on various issues. His tone during this introduction carried an undercurrent of skepticism, describing her views as controversial and suggesting that many of his viewers would find her politics alarming. Crockett maintained a professional demeanor, thanking Morgan for having her on the program and expressing her appreciation for the opportunity to discuss important policy issues with a British audience. For approximately 3 minutes, the conversation proceeded with relative normalcy as Morgan asked about her background and her motivations for entering politics. Crockett provided thoughtful responses, explaining her experiences as a civil rights attorney and how witnessing systemic injustice had motivated her to seek a position where she could advocate for legislative solutions to the problems she had encountered in her legal practice. The shift in tone occurred when Morgan pivoted to policy questions, and his confrontational approach immediately became evident. He asked Crockett about her support for criminal justice reform, but before she could complete even her first sentence of explanation, Morgan interrupted to assert that progressive district attorneys in American cities had created a crime wave by refusing to prosecute criminals. When Crockett attempted to respond that the actual data showed more nuanced patterns and that many factors contributed to crime rates, Morgan interrupted again to cite specific examples of violent crimes committed by individuals who had been released from custody. Each time Crockett tried to provide context or correct factual inaccuracies in Morgan's assertions, he would cut her off with a new accusation or example. The pattern established itself quickly. Morgan would make a provocative claim, Crockett would begin to respond with evidence-based analysis, and Morgan would interrupt before she could complete her point. The interruptions escalated as the interview progressed to healthcare policy. When Crockett explained her support for Medicare for All as a system that would provide comprehensive healthcare coverage, while ultimately reducing overall costs through elimination of insurance company profit margins and administrative overhead, Morgan immediately interrupted to declare that socialized medicine was a proven failure in Britain's National Health Service. He cited wait times for certain procedures and suggested that Crockett wanted to impose a failing British system on America. Crockett attempted to clarify that there were important differences between various universal healthcare models, and that the evidence from multiple countries demonstrated that universal coverage could be achieved with better health outcomes and lower per capita costs than the American system currently produced. Morgan talked over her response, insisting that she was naive about economics and that wealthy people would flee America if forced into a government healthcare system. The conversation had ceased to be an interview and had become a monologue with brief interruptions from the ostensible guest. As the interview continued, Morgan's volume steadily increased, while his willingness to let Crockett speak decreased proportionally. He moved to the topic of race and systemic inequality, an area where his skepticism toward progressive analysis was particularly pronounced. When Crockett began discussing the documented disparities in criminal justice outcomes, educational opportunities, and economic mobility that affected communities of color, Morgan interrupted to insist that she was promoting victimhood and refusing to acknowledge progress that had been made since the civil rights movement. He raised his voice significantly, declaring that constant focus on historical injustice prevented people from taking personal responsibility for their circumstances. Crockett remained remarkably calm, in contrast to Morgan's rising agitation, attempting to explain that acknowledging systemic factors did not negate individual agency, and that understanding historical context was essential for designing effective policy interventions. Morgan was having none of it, his voice growing louder, as he accused progressive politicians of deliberately dividing people by race to gain political advantage. The confrontation reached its peak when Morgan pivoted to economic policy and taxation. He asked Crockett whether she believed in capitalism or whether she was actually a socialist who wanted to destroy the American economic system. Before Crockett could answer, Morgan launched into a passionate defense of free markets and wealth creation, his voice rising to a near shout as he declared that progressive taxation policies would drive job creators out of the country and devastate the economy. He pointed his finger at Crockett and demanded to know why she thought the government had any right to confiscate wealth from successful people who had earned their money through hard work and innovation. His face had turned noticeably red, and spittle flew as he emphasized certain words with particular force. The cameras captured every moment of his theatrical fury, which was precisely the kind of television that had made Morgan famous and infamous in equal measure. Throughout this escalating tirade, Jasmine Crockett maintained an expression of patient attention. She did not raise her voice to match Morgan's volume. She did not interrupt his interruptions. She simply waited, occasionally taking a sip of water, while Morgan exhausted his prepared talking points about the supposed failures and dangers of progressive economic policy. Her calm in the face of his aggression created a striking visual contrast that viewers immediately noticed. Where Morgan appeared increasingly unhinged and emotional, Crockett looked composed and professional. Where Morgan seemed desperate to dominate the conversation through sheer force of volume, Crockett projected confidence that she did not need to shout to make her points effectively. The control dynamics of the interview had shifted in ways that Morgan did not yet fully recognize. When Morgan finally paused to take a breath after his extended denunciation of progressive taxation, Crockett seized the moment with perfect timing. She did not raise her voice. She did not match his emotional intensity. Instead, she spoke in a measured, clear tone that commanded attention, precisely because it contrasted so dramatically with the shouting that had preceded it. She said, "Piers, I have sat here for 20 minutes, while you have repeatedly interrupted me, mischaracterized my positions, cited incorrect statistics, and now you have spent the last 3 minutes yelling at me about positions I have never actually advocated for. So before we continue, I need to make several corrections to the false premises underlying your questions, because we cannot have a productive conversation if you are arguing against positions that exist only in your imagination, rather than engaging with what I actually believe and what the evidence actually shows." The directness of this response visibly startled Morgan, who was accustomed to guests either wilting under his aggressive approach or escalating into equally emotional responses that made for dramatic television but undermined their credibility. Crockett had done neither. She had calmly but firmly called out his behavior and established that she would not proceed with the interview under false premises. Morgan attempted to interrupt, beginning to object that he was simply asking tough questions, but Crockett held up one hand in a gesture that somehow commanded silence, despite having none of the aggressive energy Morgan had been projecting. She continued speaking in the same measured tone, and remarkably, Morgan fell silent to listen. The power dynamic had shifted completely in that moment. Crockett proceeded with methodical precision to correct the factual errors that had formed the foundation of Morgan's attacks. She addressed the crime statistics first, explaining that Morgan had cherry-picked examples from specific cities, while ignoring broader national trends that showed violent crime had actually decreased in many jurisdictions that had implemented progressive prosecution reforms. She cited specific data from the FBI uniform crime reports and academic studies analyzing the relationship between prosecution policies and crime rates, noting that the actual evidence was far more complex than Morgan's simplistic narrative suggested. She spoke without notes, demonstrating comprehensive command of the empirical research, and she delivered the information in clear language that viewers could understand without requiring advanced statistical knowledge. Morgan attempted several times to interrupt with objections or new examples, but each time Crockett would calmly say, "I am not finished," and continue with her correction. Remarkably, Morgan largely complied, appearing unsure how to handle a guest who refused to be talked over, but also refused to engage in a shouting match. Moving to healthcare policy, Crockett addressed Morgan's characterization of Medicare for All as identical to Britain's National Health Service. She explained that there were multiple models of universal healthcare used successfully in different countries, that Medicare for All, as proposed in American legislation, actually more closely resembled the Canadian single-payer system than the British NHS, and that cherry-picking problems in one country's system did not constitute a comprehensive critique of the principle of universal coverage. She noted that the United States spent approximately twice as much per capita on healthcare as Britain, while achieving worse outcomes on most major health metrics, including life expectancy and infant mortality. She pointed out that the administrative costs of the American private insurance system consumed approximately 30% of healthcare spending, without contributing to actual care delivery. She spoke these facts calmly and clearly, making eye contact with Morgan throughout, and the authority with which she presented the information made it impossible to dismiss her points as uninformed opinion. On the topic of systemic racism and inequality, Crockett delivered what would become the most viral moment of the interview. Morgan had accused her of promoting victimhood and refusing to acknowledge progress. In response, Crockett said, "Piers, the fact that you interpret a factual discussion of documented disparities as promoting victimhood reveals more about your discomfort with these topics than it does about the reality of systemic inequality. When I point out that Black Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white Americans for comparable offenses, I am not promoting victimhood. I am citing data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. When I discuss the racial wealth gap that has remained largely unchanged for 50 years despite the civil rights movement, I am not denying progress. I am acknowledging that legal equality does not automatically translate into economic equality when the effects of centuries of exclusion from wealth-building opportunities persist. Your insistence that we can only discuss these issues in terms of progress or victimhood is a false binary that prevents us from having honest conversations about how to address ongoing disparities. The clinical precision of this response, delivered without anger or defensiveness but with absolute clarity, had a devastating effect on Morgan's position. He had framed the discussion as a choice between acknowledging progress or wallowing in victimhood, and Crockett had exposed that framing as intellectually dishonest. She had demonstrated that it was possible to recognize both historical progress and ongoing challenges simultaneously, and that Morgan's resistance to this nuanced view stemmed from his own ideological commitments rather than from any logical necessity. The cameras captured Morgan's face as he processed this response, and viewers could see him struggling to formulate a comeback that did not sound defensive or evasive. Crockett then addressed the economic policy questions that had prompted Morgan's loudest outburst. She spoke with remarkable patience given how aggressively she had been attacked moments earlier. She explained that she did indeed believe in markets and private enterprise, but that she also believed in progressive taxation to fund public goods and reduce inequality. She noted that the top marginal tax rate in the United States during the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, a period of tremendous economic growth and prosperity, had exceeded 90% for the highest earners, compared to 37% today. She pointed out that no serious economist believed that reverting to a 50 or 60% top marginal rate would cause mass exodus of wealthy individuals, as evidenced by the fact that many prosperous countries with higher tax rates than America continued to attract and retain talented people. She explained that her actual positions involved closing corporate tax loopholes, implementing a wealth tax on fortunes exceeding $50 million, and ensuring that investment income was taxed at comparable rates to wage income, none of which bore any resemblance to the caricature of socialism that Morgan had been attacking. Throughout these corrections, Morgan's attempts to interrupt became increasingly half-hearted. Several times he would begin to object but would trail off as Crockett calmly continued speaking, her unflappable demeanor making his bluster seem increasingly impotent. The visual contrast became more pronounced with each passing minute. Morgan, who had begun the interview projecting confidence and control, now appeared defensive and uncertain. Crockett, who had endured 20 minutes of interruptions and shouting, had emerged as the clear authority in the room. She had not needed to raise her voice or match Morgan's aggression. She had simply waited for the appropriate moment and then methodically dismantled the foundations of his attacks through calm presentation of facts and logical argument. The most remarkable aspect of Crockett's performance was her emotional regulation throughout the exchange. Many politicians, when confronted with Morgan's aggressive style, would either become defensive and emotional themselves or would shut down and give terse, unsatisfying responses. Crockett had done neither. She had maintained her composure while also refusing to be silenced or dismissed. She had demonstrated that it was possible to be forceful and direct in pushing back against bad faith questioning without resorting to the interviewer's own tactics. Her approach communicated strength precisely because it required more discipline and control than simply yelling back would have. Any observer could yell and interrupt. It required real skill and confidence to remain calm while systematically destroying someone's argument point by point. As the interview wound toward its conclusion, Morgan made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. He suggested that Crockett's policies, however eloquently defended, remained outside the American mainstream and would never be implemented because voters ultimately rejected radical progressive ideas. This was intended as a closing argument that would let Morgan end the interview on his terms. Crockett's response would become one of the most quoted political statements of the year. She said, "Piers, when you poll Americans on actual policy positions without attaching partisan labels, progressive ideas consistently receive majority support. Medicare for all polls above 60%, raising taxes on the wealthy polls above 70%, marijuana legalization polls above 70%, $15 minimum wage polls above 60%. The reason you describe these positions as radical is not because voters reject them, but because they threaten existing power structures that benefit from the status quo. The real question is not whether these ideas are popular, but whether our political system is responsive enough to translate popular will into policy, or whether it has been so corrupted by money and special interests that majority preferences are routinely ignored in favor of policies that benefit wealthy donors and corporations." This closing statement accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It countered Morgan's assertion about mainstream opinion with concrete polling data. It reframed progressive policies as actually representing majority views rather than fringe positions. It raised fundamental questions about democratic responsiveness and the influence of money in politics. And it did all of this while maintaining the calm, factual tone that had characterized Crockett's entire corrective intervention. Morgan had no effective response. He attempted to dispute the polling numbers, but Crockett offered to provide sources for every statistic she had cited. He tried to argue that polls were unreliable, but this required him to undermine his own previous appeals to public opinion. He eventually simply thanked Crockett for appearing on the program and moved to end the interview, which itself represented a kind of concession that the conversation had not gone as he had planned. The immediate reaction to the interview on social media was extraordinary in both volume and consensus. Clips of the confrontation began circulating within minutes of the broadcast ending, and within hours had accumulated millions of views across multiple platforms. The contrast between Morgan's aggressive shouting and Crockett's calm corrections made for compelling viewing that transcended typical partisan divides. Progressive activists naturally celebrated Crockett's performance, sharing clips widely with commentary, praising her composure and command of facts. But notably, the positive response extended well beyond her natural political base. Many commentators who did not necessarily agree with her policy positions nonetheless acknowledged that she had handled Morgan's aggressive interviewing style masterfully. Media critics analyzed the interview as a case study in effective communication under hostile conditions. Political strategists from both parties studied her techniques for remaining composed under attack while still forcefully defending her positions. The clips that went most viral were the moments where the contrast between the two participants was most stark. The segment where Morgan was red-faced and shouting about socialism, while Crockett sat calmly waiting to respond, became an immediate meme template, with users inserting humorous captions about patience and composure. The moment where Crockett delivered her systematic corrections while Morgan sat uncharacteristically silent was shared repeatedly with commentary about the power of facts over feelings. The closing statement about polling on progressive policies was extracted and shared as a standalone clip that educated many viewers who had never actually seen data on public opinion regarding these issues. Each of these viral moments reinforced the narrative that Crockett had completely dominated the interview through preparation, composure, and intellectual command. The response from mainstream media outlets generally validated this narrative. Political journalists who reviewed the full interview noted the stark difference in how the two participants conducted themselves. Several commentators specifically praised Crockett for not taking the bait of Morgan's provocations, recognizing that engaging on his emotional level would have undermined her credibility regardless of the substance of her arguments. Media analysts discussed how the interview demonstrated the limitations of aggressive confrontational interviewing when the subject refuses to be rattled. Constitutional law professors who watched the exchange commented on Crockett's effective use of her legal training, noting that her systematic approach to correcting misstatements resembled the method attorneys use when cross-examining hostile witnesses. The consensus among serious observers was that Crockett had delivered a master class in political communication. For Piers Morgan, the aftermath proved professionally uncomfortable. He was accustomed to his interviews generating controversy that centered on his guests' positions or behavior rather than on his own conduct. This time, the story was explicitly about how thoroughly Crockett had handled him. British media covered the interview extensively, with several outlets noting that an American politician had come to Morgan's own studio and systematically dismantled his arguments. Conservative commentators who often defended Morgan found themselves in the awkward position of either acknowledging that he had been bested or attempting to spin the interview in ways that the widely shared video clearly contradicted. Morgan initially attempted to claim victory through selective editing and framing on his social media accounts, but these efforts were undermined by the fact that full video of the interview was freely available and showed exactly how one-sided the exchange had become once Crockett began her corrections. In subsequent episodes of his program, Morgan made several attempts to relitigate the interview and defend his approach. He insisted that he had asked important, challenging questions that progressive politicians needed to answer. He argued that his aggressive style served viewers by preventing politicians from delivering practiced talking points without scrutiny. These defenses rang hollow, given that the interview had actually demonstrated the opposite. Morgan's constant interruptions and mischaracterizations had prevented substantive discussion, and it was only when Crockett forced him to let her speak uninterrupted that viewers got detailed policy explanations. His attempts to defend himself only kept the story alive and generated additional commentary about his inability to gracefully acknowledge that he had been outmaneuvered. The interview had significant implications for Jasmine Crockett's public profile and political future. She had already been well known among progressive activists and political observers, but the Morgan interview introduced her to a much broader international audience. The clips circulated so widely that even people with minimal interest in American politics became familiar with the congresswoman who had calmly destroyed Piers Morgan's arguments. Her congressional office reported an enormous surge in constituent outreach, with messages coming from across the country and even from international supporters. Her social media following grew exponentially. Fundraising for her re-election campaign received a massive boost, as small-dollar donors inspired by her performance contributed to ensure she could continue her work in Congress. Perhaps more importantly, the interview established Crockett as someone who could handle hostile media environments with exceptional skill. This reputation had practical political value, as it meant that future opponents and critics would think twice before attempting similar confrontational interviews, knowing that she was fully capable of turning such encounters to her advantage. It also increased her value as a surrogate for other Democratic candidates and causes, since campaign managers knew she could handle tough interviews without damaging the message or appearing defensive. The interview became part of her political brand, referenced regularly as evidence of her strength under pressure and her intellectual command of policy details. The encounter between Piers Morgan and Jasmine Crockett became required viewing in political communication courses at universities across America and Britain. Professors used the video to illustrate principles of effective communication, including emotional regulation, systematic argumentation, use of evidence, and tactical timing. Students analyzed how Crockett had recognized that matching Morgan's emotional intensity would have been strategically counterproductive, and how her calm demeanor had actually emphasized the weakness of his position more effectively than an angry response would have. The interview served as a practical example of how theoretical concepts about rhetoric and persuasion operated in real high-stakes political discourse. The longer-term implications extended beyond the immediate participants to shape broader conversations about media practices and political discourse. The interview provided concrete evidence for critics who argued that confrontational shouting match interviewing served entertainment purposes rather than informational ones. It demonstrated that substantive policy discussion required allowing subjects to actually explain their positions, rather than constantly interrupting with gotcha questions. Media ethicists pointed to the exchange as an example of the difference between holding politicians accountable through rigorous questioning versus simply trying to make them look foolish through hostile treatment. These discussions contributed to evolving standards and expectations regarding how political interviews should be conducted to maximize public benefit. For progressive political organizations, the interview became a teaching tool used in candidate training programs. Communications consultants showed clips to prospective candidates as examples of how to handle hostile media environments. The specific techniques Crockett had employed, including maintaining composure, systematically correcting false premises, and delivering substantive policy explanations in accessible language, were identified as replicable skills that other politicians could develop through preparation and practice. The interview thus had practical impact on how an entire generation of progressive candidates approached media relations and confrontational interviews. The lasting significance of the encounter lies in what it revealed about the changing dynamics of political communication in the digital age. Traditional media figures like Piers Morgan had built their careers and influence during a period when they could largely control narratives through selective editing and platform gatekeeping. The viral circulation of complete unedited clips through social media platforms meant that audiences could evaluate interactions directly rather than accepting the framing provided by the interviewer or their network. Crockett had understood this dynamic and played directly to the broader audience rather than just to Morgan. She had recognized that the millions who would see clips of the interview on their social media feeds were the real judges of who had prevailed, not Morgan's immediate audience or his editorial framing. This strategic awareness of how modern media actually functions gave her a significant advantage that Morgan, for all his experience, had not fully appreciated. The interview ultimately stands as a pivotal moment, demonstrating that volume and aggression do not necessarily prevail over calm competence and factual command. It showed that politicians who thoroughly prepare, maintain emotional control, and refuse to accept false premises can successfully navigate even the most hostile media environments. It proved that audiences across the political spectrum generally respond positively to substantive discussion conducted with professionalism and respect. These lessons continue to resonate throughout political communication, making the Piers Morgan and Jasmine Crockett interview a reference point for understanding effective political engagement in contemporary media landscapes. We appreciate your attention to this comprehensive analysis of a defining moment in contemporary political discourse. Please consider subscribing to our channel to receive ongoing coverage of significant political developments and communication strategies that shape public understanding of critical issues. Your engagement through comments contributes to productive dialogue about media practices and political communication effectiveness. We encourage you to share this analysis with colleagues and networks who would benefit from understanding how calm, factual responses can effectively counter aggressive, confrontational interviewing, and why such examples matter for the quality of public discourse in democratic societies.